U.S. naval blockade yesterday at 10 a.m.
Chinese tanker reportedly passes U.S. Hormuz blockade. It's a Chinese flag ship. Let's hear where the double blockade is at now.
Eastern, we're around 17 hours in. And basically, a lot of the traffic, the little trickle we've seen since the start of the war has come to a screeching halt, apart from one incident. And this is really interesting because this is a Chinese-owned vessel. It's now said to have tested the U.S. naval blockade because it has passed through the Strait of Hormuz. Let's take you through this. This is a rich starry. This is a tanker said to be carrying methanol. It started moving from Sharjah here in the UAE. Remember, a lot of these vessels turn off the AIS transponder, so you don't really know the origin of which port that they moved from. Starting to move towards Keshem and Larak Islands, then, starts a boating mission, moves back, and then starts to take that route once again, passing through the strait in the early hours of this morning. Now, this is a tanker that has been sanctioned since March 2023 by the U.S. Treasury Department because it has links to Iran. Now, from what we understand from experts, this tanker was able to move through completely unfazed by the U.S. naval blockade. So we don't know what exactly transpired and how the United States is enforcing this blockade. But this is really interesting to see this tanker that has, links to Iran, that has been sanctioned by the United States, being able to move through the Strait of Hormuz at this time. A lot of the shippers are very reticent to even make the voyage. Number one, they're worried about having to coordinate directly with the Iranians. And then number two, what will they face when they hit the U.S. naval blockade? A lot of the shippers believe that this is a double dilemma in terms of negotiating with both sides. From what we know right now, that the United States is doing this naval blockade to perhaps start negotiations to force Iran to the negotiating table. You'll remember that a lot of the revenues that Iran is getting right now at the start of this war had to do with the toll that they were charging the shippers, Rosemary, and then importantly, the Iranian oil that was being sold. And if you look at some of the tanker traffic since the start of the war, it has been dominated by Iranian-linked vessels and also vessels that are friendly to Iran. So the United States and President Trump has been very clear about this, that any vessels, any shippers that have paid that toll fee could face indictment. And you have an interesting bar chart here showing just how much the traffic plummeted since the start of the war. And you've seen a trickle throughout the over 40 days that we've been facing this conflict. In total, 453 vessels have transited the strait since February 28th. And importantly, just to give you a bit of a perspective, normally 130 vessels pass through the strait on a daily basis. Richard Mead is the editor-in-chief of Lloyd's List Intelligence, and he's with us now live from London. Richard, good to see you. You and I have been talking consistently since the start of the war, and there's been, really interesting developments, specifically over the past few hours. After the U.S. naval blockade came into effect, we saw one Chinese-linked tanker that was sanctioned by the United States since 2023 transiting through the strait after initially had, backed out and then moved through once again. What do we know about the rich starry and whether it was challenged by the U.S. Navy?
Well, at the moment, we know very little. It's still moving.
Go, rich starry, go. Gore, rich starry, gore. Do it for the world, rich starry. CENTCOM denies that any ship made it past the blockade. Of course they did.
Suggests that it hasn't been challenged by the US. To be clear, we're not entirely sure that this was laden with Iranian crude. It's been used as floating storage for a while. It entered back into the Gulf about 10 to 12 days ago, from memory. And then it was heading out of the Gulf this weekend and did a bit of a U-turn at the point that Donald Trump announced the blockade. It then made a break for it last night and has exited. Now, this is, as you say, a sanctioned, falsely flagged ship. It is nominally fraudulently flagged to Malawi, but we know it's a fraud. This probably would be a target, but it seems to have got out. We've also got a number of other shadow fleet tankers, one of which is sanctioned, heading in. So it's going to be interesting to see how the US responds to this. But right now, the vast majority of shipping is not moving on either side.
Yeah, so give me a sense of what shippers are telling you. There's a lot of confusion about who to negotiate with. On the Iranian side, I mean, it's been very clear, coordinate directly with Iranian forces. Now you've got the US naval blockade. Is there any appetite to move through the Straits, even if...
I mean, I think what America's trying to do is force the hand desperate shipping companies to not go through the toll process and avoid the Iranian Navy and go directly through the American blockade. Because, like, what they've said they're doing is, like, if you touch an Iranian port, which as it stands, all ships that transit through the Strait of Hormuz can only go through the strait if they stop at an Iranian port, at which point they will pay a toll and then move through the Iranian port and safely transit the Strait of Hormuz. So what they're trying to do, I think, create is an environment where, like, maybe some of these oil tankers are, like, dumb enough to try and transit without paying a toll, and only those ships will be allowed safe passage by the American blockade. Because even if you're not a Chinese flag tanker, even if you're not an Iranian shadow fleet tanker, even if you're just a United Arab Emirates tanker or like any other flag tanker, if you stop at the Iranian port, then America is supposed to stop you, right? Like, that's basically the way that they've designed it. Having said that, however, it's totally ridiculous if the goal here is to stabilize the global markets. If the goal here is to stabilize energy prices, then adding a secondary restriction makes it worse overall. Total Energy CEO says, "We prefer paying fees to Iran rather than closing the Strait of Hormuz." There you have it. These are some of the first, but very important voices that are, letting their position be publicly known.
Vessels are not at any Iranian ports or Iranian territorial waters.
Right now, no. And I keep telling you, uncertainty is reigning across the shipping industry.
Yeah.
That goes in peaks and troughs. If you'd asked me just before the weekend, I would have told you that there were at least half a dozen ship owners that were preparing their ships to move out. And we did see probably the busiest period of activity in terms of transits through the strait over the weekend. Around 30 ships transited. The shutters then came down. And as far as I can tell from most mainstream ship owners with their tankers still inside the Gulf, absolutely no appetite to move right now until they get some clarity. For those that were looking to get in, they are, again, waiting to see what happens over the next few hours. You've got a double blockade, essentially.
Yeah.
You've got the US essentially blockading Iranian-linked tankers, and then you've got the existing restrictions and threats. And if you do engage with the Iranians, are the US going to get you, and vice versa? The shipping industry is stuck in the middle right now.
Yeah, I mean, I also, was looking at marine traffic data, and in total, since the war began, there are around 450 vessels that have been able to transit through the Strait of Hormuz, keeping in mind that it's usually 130 vessels per day. The big question now becomes, how many of these vessels...
Classic CNN still having these issues, by the way. It's so strange that the audio issues still persist on CNN's
paid
videos.
a toll to Iran, given that President Trump has said any vessel and any shipper that has paid will be indicted. What data do we have on who actually paid Iran directly?
Very little direct evidence, and that's deliberately so. I think everybody was very nervous about the tolls. Essentially, the money that was being paid was going directly to the IRGC, which is designated as a terrorist organization by certainly the US and the EU. No Western ship owner is going to want a paper record of that. And we know that settlement was being done in yuan or crypto. So I think probably there's a few nervous ship owners that we know to have paid. But I would stress that the vast majority probably haven't paid. I think you're looking at a three-tier system. There's the Iranian ships themselves. Obviously, they're not charging their own ships to go through. There's the ones that got through with diplomatic agreements. So the Indian government has been absolutely clear that they definitely did not pay for any of their tankers to get out. And there are similar agreements with lots of other countries. There are a small amount that we know to have settled at least a fee. Now, in some cases, that was a large fee, around...
Yuan got so much aura as a currency, not gonna lie, cold name, strong and shit, true.
$2 million for a couple of tankers that we know about. In some cases, this was being passed off as an administration cost. more in the tune of around $150,000 to $200,000. So I think probably there's going to be a few nervous questions as to how some of these ships got out, but that's for tomorrow. Right now, it's a question of what happens immediately and how we get the vessels moving.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump wants to see the strait opening up. Do you think that putting in a U.S. blockade is going to have that effect?
It's a little bit early to tell. I think, as I say, right now nothing is moving. So I think
there was a piece in Foreign Policy from the Quincy Institute about how Iran and the U.S. could potentially strike a deal by agreeing to a toll system, but one that is done in dollars. It would strengthen the weakening petrodollar while also providing Iran with reparation revenue that Congress would never authorize. It would also be good for Iran's reserves. What do you think? Yeah, I think Iran would be fine getting paid in dollars, but the issue here is America weaponizing the dollar system against Iran and against its enemies, right? So there has to be some kind of guarantee. And I guess the guarantee in and of itself would be the fact that Iran controls the strait and could shut it off. That is guarantee enough, right? Iran enforcing its power, its control over the Strait of Hormuz would probably be a major guarantee that America can't fuck with it any longer and apply these sanctions back on Iran when it sees fit at the behest of Israel.
To that extent, it is having an impact, but we know that there's a couple of ships heading in westbound. We don't know whether they're going to try to get into Iranian ports. We've just seen that there's one heading eastbound using what we call a zombie number. These are essentially tankers using identification of ships that have been scrapped years ago, trying to falsely, give themselves an identity. It'll be interesting to see whether the US Navy intercepts any of these. I think we're really now just waiting to see what the actual action is and the enforcement strategy from the US side.
All right, Richard Mead, really great to have you with us.
Richard Mead going meat for meat.